angel hair and ice cream castles in the air and feather canyons everywhere. I've looked at clouds that way, but now they only block the sun. They rain and snow on everyone. So many things I would have done, but clouds got in my way.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Humpday Afterglow. Actually, this is our, believe it or not, 11th broadcast of what I have so eloquently, ingeniously with my mind came up with, which was that K-I-R-T spelled Kurt in real time. And I was just so impressed with myself that I came up with this brilliant idea for the name for these live streams. So thank you. You can congratulate me if you would like. But anyways, great to have you, whether you're live or you're going to watch this recorded. And if you're watching it recorded, we missed you. Come back next time. Join us when we're live, so that way we can chat in the comments and all that good stuff. But one thing I like to say is, whether live or recorded, if you're joining this, if you're all about being the real you and showing real love and compassion to the world around you, you're in the right place. You found your peeps. What they're all about as well. And so, yeah, welcome. And also welcome specifically to another episode of Humpday Afterglow. I need to get like one of those cool mics where I could lean into it with like a deep voice, say welcome, and do something sexy with it. But we're not like really high production value here at Curtain Real Time. So that's okay. We're keeping it real. But thank you for coming to this episode. What we're all about here, especially when we're having these monthly live streams, these Humpday Afterglow, there we go, is really, if you're committed to being authentic sexuality and having a healthy sex life, showing the real and showing, if that's what you're all about, then again, you're in the right place. That's what this conversation tends to be like. Now we have a tradition. I guess I can say we have a tradition now that we've done several of these. Once you do something twice in a row, does it count as a tradition? I don't know, but I'm just going to propose that it is a tradition, and that is the monthly Humpday Afterglow sex counter. So if you want to put down in the comments, you're more than welcome to do that. Here's how the sex counter works. It's just literally a number. It's just a number. And I always like to preface it by saying, if you put a number in the comments, and I'll tell you my number in just a second. The interesting thing about sex is that the number could be really high or it could be zero. And either of those options could be very healthy and good. It all comes down to what feels healthy, what feels safe and right and desirable for you. And I've had points and times in my life where I went many days, months, almost a couple of years at one point without having sex, to other times where I've had sex like 30 plus times in a month. So, and that's all good. It's really comes down to if it's healthy, if it's desirable, safe. So my number for this month, and by the way, when we give these numbers, no conversation. It's up to you to reflect on it and really be like, hey, I think that felt good. That feels like a good number for this month. Like, yeah, that's what I desired and I enjoyed with my partner or partners, whatever sexual lifestyle you embrace and that is true to yourself. So mine is 8 for this month. And you can put your comment, you can drop the number in there, or just think about it. If you're watching this later, you're like, okay, that's it. That's the monthly sex counter. Well, listen, I am very pleased to have a special guest with us tonight. Somebody who I can say is not just a guest, not as only a bright, articulate voice on the subject that we're going to dive into tonight. She's also a very close personal friend. And I'm very glad to have her. So I'm going to bring Kara Haug into the room. Where is she? There she is. Greetings, Kara. Hold on. There you go. Oh, you're on mute. There you go. Now you're
I was on mute. Sorry.
always on. Good evening.
Still figuring it out.
Looking lovely this evening, Miss Kara.
Thank you. Thank you.
People who know me, and Kara knows this, and other people know me. I do have a thing for redheads. So Kara is always, not only her wonderful qualities, her knowledge, her intelligence, but just the fact that you have beautiful red hair. I'm immediately drawn to you, and I'm grateful to have you here. That's an awkward way to start. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kurt. Anyways, now listen. We've had lots of conversations. In fact, I'll make sure to drop a link, but I got to get that link. Remind me, Kara, and I'll drop it in the comments later after this recording is done and it gets posted to YouTube where people can watch it later. But the great live stream or the podcast that we did, you, me, and our wonderful friend Rula, on the kind of the subject of sex, but really in the context of religion and religious communities and the church. And it was a really fascinating conversation. So I'll have to snag that link or find it, and I'll drop it in the comments. So, but we've had lots of conversations, whether it's formal or it's online, or it's just lots more informal. And we're going to talk tonight about something that Kara is an expert in.
That's true.
Do you feel like an expert?
I would say I'm starting to feel like one. No, I do.
Yeah.
But I think, with human sexuality, it's something that you're constantly learning, right? Like I have to just keep learning and learning and learning as I go. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why I absolutely love studying human sexuality is because there's so much more to learn, and it opens my world so much. So, yeah,
that's a great answer.
It keeps you on your toes.
That you've learned some things, and I know this. You have a lot to offer, but that there's so much more. I love people who stay curious, who are always asking questions, who are always gathering more information and listening to more experiences, and that's what Kara is all about. In this area, the subject that we're talking tonight is about sex ed and parenting. We're both parents. We both have children, and we both were children, believe it or not. At one point in time, we were children in the past. We won't say how long ago in the past, but we were there in the past. Me longer in the past, but anyways, so we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. And I thought, first thing to start with is this question. What did you learn about sex as a child and as an adolescent from your parents or from other sources that were around you? What would you say you learned?
Well, I had very confusing messages, I think. I think we all did. That living, in my opinion, in the American culture, we've all grown up with, I think, mixed messages and confusing messages about sex. I would say I grew up from my parents. Again, I got two conflicting messages. So I was under their impression that as a female growing up in the 80s and 90s, that I needed to be pure. I needed to abstain until marriage. And then I needed to be like a good girl, right? Like this was what I was learning. But then I also had messages I had a mother who told me, I expect you to remain a virgin until you're married. I had a father who then was like, let me know when you start having sex and we'll get you the birth control pill. And I was like, what is happening?
Yeah.
Neither of these things make sense.
Yeah.
And then I also, the purity movement was huge in our culture. I remember reading I Kissed Dating Goodbye. I remember going to the Christian bookstore and buying all the books, right? Like Max Lucado and all these things. That was very influential in my life. But then also looking at popular culture films that in the 80s, if you go, like I watched them over now and I was like, these are so sexualized. And what were we doing? And to know that some of these films we watched with our parents, um, and just the amount of like, for instance, just the amount of like boobs that show up in these films that are rated PG is just so shocking to me now as like a parent who's watching them in a different lens and as a sex educator. And so I had confusing messages. I think I primarily aligned with I need to be a good girl,
Mhm.
especially because I felt like I needed to be loved. And I felt like if I remained good, then I would be loved.
Mhm. Yeah.
Right. And so that's, I think, how I followed a lot of my childhood, my upbringing.
Yeah. And of course, that's something we have in common is that we both grew up in like the heydays of the rise of the religious right, but also that the purity culture really being pushed hard in like the context of churches and youth groups. Um, that was but I was hearing it from the standpoint as a male, and something I have certainly, as I've reflected and listened, particularly to women who grew up in that context. I feel there's a great deal of soberness because there was entirely unfair expectations on women, a far heavier burden, right? Like when if a boy messes up or makes a mistake,
Yeah.
it's the consequences are minuscule in comparison to what young women would feel in that context if they had sex outside of marriage.
Right.
And I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that or reflections just about the unique pressures that were particularly on young women in that context that were being drilled. This concept of purity was being just drilled away.
Yeah. I mean, in all honesty, yes. I mean, like there was very much, I think, more pressure put on girls. But I also feel like that still is in existence today. Like if we look at just what's happening politically, I mean, this stuff still plays out. And when I work with teenagers, there's still that dichotomy of if a girl expresses her sexuality, then she's labeled a slut and a whore,
Mhm.
and easy and is kind of diminished. And um, yeah, so I mean, I feel like unfortunately, these scripts that we have decided to continuously pass down from generation to generation, that we are recognizing it's hard because we recognize that these narratives are also not helpful for us. Um, and sadly, I think a lot of it, I'm getting ahead of myself, but oftentimes we aren't looking at how those really affect us. Like not
Mhm.
all of us have like taken the time to sit to be like, how did these messages affect me growing up?
Yeah.
Um, Many are starting to, but there's also a lot of people who aren't. And I think we just continuously pass down then these scripts and this sense of shame that we hold to the
Yeah.
next generation. And it starts with, like the messages you were given of what it means to be a man and what does that look like and how are you supposed to operate. What, in order to be that, do you need to ignore to be that person? And then
Mhm.
what are you depriving of yourself in terms of like emotional wellness and, like connection with
Yeah.
others? Um, and so there's just so much of a disservice that I have recognized now as a mom and a wife and as a sex educator that we do to ourselves.
Yeah.
Um, and that's one of the reasons why I got into this job.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I can relate to that sense of suppressing, because there was a part of me that was just very naturally curious and excited and wanted and was growing in, attraction and but I did not have that experience of having two parents. My parents were united in the front of like purity culture, um, keep oneself pure. Uh, I was just going to say now and this is a much heavier matter. Like for me, sex education, and this isn't something that I didn't discover until much later in life, and then have had to unpack. Also included a few instances of child molestation as a young child, actually at the hands of my father, who then, but my parents, stayed together. That was like a deep, dark secret. And then, and I think my mom pivoted to always being around, largely to, in essence, make sure that that thing didn't happen anymore. But she still protected her husband, my father, from any shame or judgment that could have come upon him. So, but that was completely at a subconscious level that I wasn't even aware of. Like that, what I was being taught was like, so at a very, very young age, it was like this. I was being exposed to to sex or sexuality in a very warped and unhealthy and unsafe way. Then that went dormant. And then I was in an environment where basically outside of like, don't do it until you're married,
Mm-hmm.
I got next to nothing. It was like, it was like, put on a purity ring. Like I said, when I was in college, I remember I kissed dating goodbye, and that became the huge craze. And I remember like, and I went to a conservative Bible college, then Multnomah Bible College, now Multnomah University, or whatever they call it now. But anyways, and I remember guys like holding each other accountable, like, don't masturbate at all. Like, and we'd be like, oh, I went 2 months and then I gave in. And then we'd all would like confess to each other and all that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? It was just like, there's this, like, meanwhile, like you mentioned, like I was also a kid growing up in the 80s and the 90s. Mm-hmm. So I have to show this. This is so a couple of my other sex ed teachers, I would say, would be this. Like, I remember like we subscribed to Sports Illustrated. So I remember when like I think that's the 1987 or 88, Elle Macpherson, like Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition came, and I think I captured it somehow. I intercepted it before my mom would have seen it and threw it away, and secretly held onto it and I was just like, oh my God, the female body, this is crazy. Or the other way I would go about doing is like I go over to like my more. I had a friend who was in the church. Like his grandma went to the church and he attended, but he wasn't really particularly religious. And they had HBO, and of course HBO late at night became basically softcore porn. Yeah. That was what HBO was known for. And I remember seeing the movie over at his house and watching the movie 9.5 Weeks with Kim Basinger and Mickey Rourke. And my head was exploding. I'm like, what is happening? And so I had these messages from pop culture that were very hypersexualized, like, that were in essence kind of resonating with certain aspects of me in terms of my interest and my burgeoning, sense of sexuality and interest in sex. But it was also very unattainable and it was very unrealistic and, how Hollywood idealized. So there's a lot to be said to critique that just as much as there is. Maybe I won't say just as much as there is. I would say that the religious purity culture feels almost far more toxic and damaging than necessarily being exposed to certain things. But that's just my thought at the moment. But those are the things I used to, and then I was like, also I remember like when Top Gun came out in 1985, and there's a real spicy scene. I almost thought about playing the clip, but it was because it's funny because I'm like, oh my God, it's a silhouette. Like, oh, I saw a tongue. Oh my God, what's happening? Like, I mean, so I was getting exposed to those things. And that was like how I learned about sex ed. I wasn't allowed to date until I was 16. But by the time I turned 16, I was so terrified and had no clue about how to go about doing that. So I just never dated until I asked my high school crush to the senior prom. That was literally my first date. And I didn't go on another date until like a year later. It was very sporadic. Just didn't know what to do. So that was kind of my experience with sex ed growing up.
I just also, I specifically remember after my first kiss, I was like 12, and I instantly was like, do I have an STI?
Yeah.
I literally like instantly went to like the fear of even just this sweet little innocent kiss. But because I feel like our culture, first of all, when any sex ed that we had back then, the majority, the sex ed was based on fear, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of it around STIs, and then like if you have sex, you're going to die. If you do any of this, you're going to die, or you're going to, get pregnant, or any of these things. And I feel like I have cats that are coming into my room.
That's awesome.
And opening the door wide. So that's great.
Cool. Well, if you need to hop up and close the door or whatever,
Let me go close.
Do it. Yeah, go for it. Go for it. It's all good.
Oh my gosh.
We're very informal here on Curtain Real Time.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, it's all good.
I was like, that's not supposed to be happening.
We have a cat and a dog, so we're familiar with children, and then kids also sometimes will just.
That's what was happening before. Is it's not good, and I'm like, no, go.
No, but you were saying, I mean that. Just to remind people, like the '80s was, I mean, the AIDS epidemic was it was at an apex, and so there was a lot of fear around that as well. But go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say that I think the real damage, like there's toxicity happened in the purity culture, because a lot of what that did was, first of all, deny any sort of trust with our own bodies. Right. So like we were taught to not listen to our bodies because of that. Because any sort of desire or feeling that we might have, the flesh is bad. Right. And so what that also does is tune off our intuition, which we need in any relationship to help know if we're in danger or not, or something is wrong. And so to already start off to not have that sense of body autonomy and like trust with our own bodies is harmful. In that sense, also to not realize that the messages we are given stay with us and they're in our brain and they can't just shut off. And so we carry all those messages into our relationships, and then we try to work them out. And when the church used to give us these messages of everything will be blissful once you get married, and then you can do all these things, and then people get married and they're just like, none of that is really happening. And they're like, what does this mean? And so it's super confusing. And so many people have said to me, I feel like I've been duped, in terms of some of the sexual functioning and relationships with their partners. But then what's also equally also toxic is when we are shown a lot of imagery like we have seen in popular culture, and then we're just like, let's not have a conversation about it. Let's not talk about any of this. Let's like, we can't do this. And so the fact that we have grown up in a society where we have like, you can't have sex until this, and this is also only pertaining to a certain demographic of people, right? And then it's like, then we're going to also, and this is only going to be talked about in like this kind of binary language. And then we have all this stuff where it's like, but we're going to show you all the kind of sexualization in the world and not talk about it. Right. So then we're going to have this silence kind of on either end, which brings, silence equals shame in that aspect. And it's also, I think when we just choose to not talk about something, we make it weird. And then we feel like we're not allowed to bring it up. And then anything of how we feel is like feels trapped, and so we get into these cycles, which doesn't make it very healthy.
No. Okay, so let's fast forward the clock a little bit. And when would you say, or maybe share an experience or something, maybe from an educational background? What were some you don't have to, one or more, but a moment of kind of enlightenment for you, where you started to kind of go like, oh, this feels right. This, like, now that we're talking about, I'm learning something about sex and sexuality that really seemed to feel good.
Well, for me, I mean, I say this story almost all the time, but the moment when I recognized that understanding and learning about sexuality, like, I had all these little things moving up to it. Like, I took women's studies and gender studies in college. I was a psychology major, and you get some of this stuff in all of those classes. But it was in seminary, of all places. I went to seminary and got a master's of theological studies. And it was my professor who we took a sexuality class. And he talked about, in order to understand, he was a therapist himself, but also talked about to understand your sexuality, or to be able to minister to people, you actually need to understand your sexuality. I was like, interesting. Okay, say more. And we did this sexual health history where we analyzed all these things, like what we're talking about, like what was the influences, what messages did we get about sex, what do we think sex was, what were some of the hard experiences or good experiences, and blah, blah, blah. And we play this all out. And through that experience, I saw very clearly patterns that I had gotten into in every single relationship. I saw very clearly the way that I spoke about myself, certain things that happened in my life at a young age that then continued, that felt traumatic, but then continued to play out in each relationship. And I was like, hold up. Like, when I saw this, and I was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And I was like, it was there when I saw the intersections that sexuality has in our life. And I was like, every human needs to do this. And if every human did this, we would be a much healthier society.
Yeah.
And so that was like what drove me to be interested. And then it was when I worked as a youth minister, and I worked with youth from a very wealthy demographic. And they instantly, the moment, they feel like you are a trustworthy person, they start saying, like, what do you think about sex? And I would be like, what do you think about sex?
Yeah.
I was like, just tell me your answer,
Yeah.
at that point. But then I would have their parents come in and be like, can we talk about sex? And the parents were asking me almost similar questions as the kids. And then I also had experience of working in a completely other area of the country in rural Michigan. And I worked in foster care. And I just saw almost like, so these are different demographics. All of them had similar questions, similar things was happening throughout. The main thread was that nobody had a clue. Nobody had a clue about their body. Nobody had a clue of what they were doing with their bodies. They were just going, I guess we do this. I guess we do this. But I don't feel good about this. And I don't feel good about that. Yeah. And I was just like, we are doing a terrible job. We're doing a terrible job understanding this. We're doing a terrible job talking about it. And as someone who has had abuse in my family, I was like, no. And then, working in foster care where so many people had experienced abuse, I was like, I cannot deal with this anymore. I cannot handle this. And so that's what made me go back to study sexual health. And I think the thing that we have to realize is that when we study sexual health and sexuality in our own lives and at large, like, we will be confronted with things. And what we're really going to be confronted with is grief and pain. And for some of us, that's really hard to work through, but I think it's so important and necessary, because we start to discover like whole new worlds about ourselves. And then we start to understand why people do the things they do. We
Mhm.
start to understand the behaviors. You start to understand that we all are just trying to feel love, and we're all just trying to feel cared for. And we're finding any way possible to have those feelings met and those needs met.
Yeah.
And that's really what I have learned the most about studying sexuality, I would say.
Interesting. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah, I'm just reflecting upon what you've shared, and I definitely find that to be true of myself as I strive, not always achieve, but I do strive to grow in self-awareness and kind of why, why did I make the choices that I made at a
Mhm.
certain point in time in my life? And as it relates to this subject around sex and sexuality, and I can go back and um, I can be both, uh, I can hold myself both accountable to make better choices, but also have a great deal of understanding and compassion
Yeah.
for why I was making those choices. And but none of that happens, like you said, in if there's this void of conversation,
Hmm.
if there's no opportunity to share knowledge
Yeah.
around our bodies, around how we relate to each other in our bodies,
Hmm.
um, and how we, at even a very human animal level, like do that in order to survive and to feel comfortable and all those like basic evolutionary needs that we have to
Yeah.
sustain ourselves as a species. So, uh, I'm grateful. Now, let's pivot a little bit, just because now let's fast forward to being parents.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me about some of your experience, and I'll share some of my experience about like sex ed with your kids and my kids.
Yeah. Well, I decided really early on, based on the fact that, I didn't actually start going to study sex until after I had my last child. So it was, I was 32 years old. But even before then, I was like, I knew that I wanted to have conversations from the very beginning. And I did. So, like, when I would even change their diapers, I would talk to them, I would look them in their eyes, I would, do different play things, like even from that young of an age of integrating touch into routine in terms of
Mm,
like um, caring and hugging your child and things like that, and looking at them in the eyes and playing with them, like that already establishing a sense of intimacy,
yeah.
and getting them to feel security. And so I would do stuff like that. I would talk to them as I changed their diaper. I would say what I was doing when I was
Mm,
changing their diaper, and say the body part names when I did that. And then also, I would answer their questions. So if they had questions, I would answer them in a way that would, first, if I didn't quite know what they were asking, I would say more, right? Like that's always a good thing. Tell me more about that. Or where did you hear that word? You know,
mhm.
just to gain more information because I sometimes as parents we're like, oh, and then we like
Yeah,
give way too much information that they're
yeah,
not ready for.
yeah.
So I just try to answer all their questions. I also try to um, make sure to be before something, So, for instance, COVID happened, pandemic learning. Kids would be on screens so much. So that is when I was like, I guess we're having a porn conversation, even when
Mhm,
they're in the middle of elementary school, right?
mhm.
And so I
Yeah,
was like, I just want you to know that online there's some wonderful things that we can do, like play games. We're entertained with different shows, but also there's things that might come up that you might see or stumble upon. And I want you to talk to me about if you do. There's sometimes people put images of other people that are naked, and that could be
mhm.
confusing. So let's talk about that if that happens and you're not in trouble, but let's just have a conversation, right?
Yeah,
Um, I also just have different rules set up in my house, especially around electronics, for those reasons. But yeah, like, so I just try to be open. I Also, I mean, sexuality is big. It's not just about sex, right? So we talk about, I also name their emotions when they're having them. I'm like, I see that you're really angry. Tell me why you're angry, or what does that mean? And then one of the things I always say to them when they tell me about an experience they might have, I say to them, how did that feel in your body? Because I think it's so important, again, to bring in body awareness all the
Mhm.
time, because our body is our best teacher.
Yeah.
So things like that. That's what I try to do.
Awesome.
Mhm.
Yeah. For my kids, it's an interesting world where they're experiencing probably even more starkly some of the conflicting messages you got as a kid.
Sure.
As you know, because I went from pastor to atheist slash agnostic slash whatever mood I'm in at the time,
Right.
uh, but certainly not adhering to a formal religion and the the dogmatic teaching around sex and sexuality that I was certainly taught growing up as well. And my oldest daughter, who's 15, there was a period in time in my life where she remembers me as a representative, as a leader in that space. And I would have to say that during those years when she was growing up, she did not, she got a lot of the same kind of lack of knowledge that I got. Uh, it just wasn't really talked about
Mhm.
because it wouldn't be inappropriate. It was inappropriate to talk about it.
Mhm.
Maybe later, some kind of undefined period, probably like you're engaged and maybe somebody will talk to you like
Mm.
do biblical counseling and they'll have a little sidebar. That's literally what my ex-wife and I had when we went through biblical like premarital counseling. And then there was like a whole session where they're like, okay, I'm gonna go off with him, the senior pastor, the male senior pastor, and then she's going to go off with the female pastor, and they're going to talk about things, and like I mean, it was that I don't know, it was that exclusive and disconnected, but but then I made big changes in my life, and then, of course, my oldest daughter eventually came out to me first, and in large part because I felt like she saw that I was genuinely struggling and fighting to be my authentic self.
Sure.
And so for her, it's kind of like, okay, you're the safe parent, certainly safer.
Yeah.
And so now, like when you have a 15-year-old gay daughter and a 10-year-old, well, one the 15-year-old doesn't have much of a filter at times and
Mhm.
is very much like, oh my God, look at her, she's hot, like man, like why would I'm like, okay. And then my 10-year-old has come to understand and embrace and accept her older sister
Right.
in her identifying or her coming to realize who she is and who what she's learning, she continues to learn. So we've tried to make it a pretty like sex positive, body positive, like household
Mhm.
within some restraints of appropriateness, but we talk about things like I just got a book last year for my youngest for that age group on sex, and it's a great book that I forgot I was going to bring it here. Um, I don't know, maybe you recommended it. I can't remember, but I found it and somehow. And so we're just trying to, I think the common thread, like you said, is when the subject comes up, I'm trying not to react to it in in that really fear-based way,
Yeah.
that hyper controlling way. Like, oh my God, where did you hear that from? Like,
Yeah.
who told you that? And you're
Mhm.
right. And it just shuts down any kind of conversation and any curiosity. So nowadays it's like we talk about that and we talk a lot about non-traditional sexual identities and sexual lifestyles so that they're considered normal. It's not, because that was the other thing. I mean, I grew up in an environment where that was abnormal, sinful even to do those things, or to live that way, or to identify that way as somebody who's not like a cisgender male or female. And so I think it's kind of the combination of like, how do we try to make it as an open environment for them to be curious and to ask questions and for us to gain knowledge, and also to normalize an environment where acceptance, where people are recognized who identify in all kinds of ways in terms of their gender identity or sexuality. So that's kind of what we're attempting to do in the Amanda Curd household.
Yeah, we try to tell our kids where we're like, we love you for who you are. And I think our job as parents, one of the things also that I teach when I do like workshops for parents and things like that, for instance, I always ask them to define sex, and people roll their eyes. They're like, oh, why are you having us do that? And I actually have them get into groups with other people to do it. And what they quickly realize is that it's actually a lot harder than they know, because actually we all have our own different definition of what sex really is. And so I tell parents, one of our jobs is to let the kids know what we think our definition is of sex. But we need to have enough conversations with them. Well, they will start to learn what their own definition is of sex. And then our hope is to help them learn how to communicate that to other people.
Yeah, that's great.
And then the other thing that I try to do with my kids too is when they ask me questions related to a sexual term, if they've heard something from their friends, or somewhere, and they're just like, Mom, what does this mean? If it is a sexual term, then they'll be like, wait, does this have to do with something you teach? And I said, it does. And so then I say, do you want to know now? I'm like, because also I'm trying to get their consent of, is this something you're ready to hear at this moment? And if it is, then I can talk to you about it. And if not, if you need to prepare yourself, then we'll talk about it again later. So I'm like, let me know if you want to hear about it. And if you don't, then if you want to later, then I'll talk to you about that later.
That's really good. I don't know if I give that as much thought because I think we're all used to just kind of like sharing our opinions or what we know, like in the moment. I'm just talking outside of parenting, even just when we're interacting with adults, but also considering, consent around, is this a desirable time or moment for somebody who's ready to take in new information and process it and kind of figure out what it means to them, and how that applies to parenting and sex ed, to ask that question, I think is, I honestly hadn't given that as much thought as I probably should have. So I appreciate that you bring up that observation among many. Kara, let's start to round or start to. I was just going to say, no, that's not I was going to use a baseball analogy, but that itself is loaded with sexual metaphors. I was like,
use it anymore.
I was like, Kara, let's round third base here, and I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah, we try not to use that terminology or that analogy anymore, right?
Yeah. As much as I love baseball, but let's start to wrap it up a little bit. I wanted to give you just a couple of minutes as well, just to talk about any potential resources or things that you offer, or even just recommendations in general, or a favorite book or two to read, just anything that kind of comes to your mind. And I'll also put up just your website, the Reframing Our Stories. That's a place where folks can go and learn more about what you and the co-founder of Reframing Our Stories, or about what you provide. But just go ahead and share for just a few minutes some things that you're passionate about, as well as just some general resources you think might be helpful to parents.
Well, I started our business, Reframing Our Stories, to talk to audiences, to, I would say, systems that I believe affect our sexuality the most. And for me, that was families, schools, and churches. So since I have that Master's of Theological Studies and things, I do go in and talk into churches as a way to help them reduce shame and figure out more open ways of how we can have these conversations that lead people into a better understanding of who they are. And really, I never in a million years ever thought I would become a sex educator. Like, seriously, when people find out about it from my past, they're like, what? Right?
Mhm.
It's just weird. But I think I want to encourage parents to, have these conversations with your kids. I think there is an overall fear around it because we were obviously not given a great example. We also, I always say kids are our best teachers and triggers. So there's going to be times where our kids are going to be an age that we were, where something happened to us, and it is going to take us right back to that
Mhm.
experience, and it will help us understand, like, oh, I think I need to heal here. Like, this is a part of me that needs to be cared for. And so I think this is, I believe that everyone deserves to have caring and loving relationships. And I believe that sexuality education can help us get there. There's so many, I mean, this is the time. This is the time where you can learn anything about sexuality. There's so many books out there.
Mhm.
Um, and so, I actually need to update my resources on my webpage, but I also, I have a podcast, and that's where I explore conversations around religion and sexuality and other intersections in our lives with health and wellness as well. I also have conversation cards actually on my website that start from pre-K and go up to sixth grade, and
Mhm.
that's to help families have these conversations every day. And all of those cards deal with bodies, they deal with emotions, they deal with relationships. I have parents who tell me that they do it at dinner time, and it has become a ritual for them. And they have told me that it has made talking so much easier. And there's other things on there, but yeah, I don't know. There's so many. I could give you links to other books and stuff. There's just
Yeah.
so many out there that are wonderful. So
Well, I will definitely, when we're all done with this, I'll do it, or you can also feel free to add links in the comments on the YouTube video, um, and hope people find their way to connect with you and those resources. I know that as you got a chance to come in and connect and help support my oldest daughter and sharing and processing some things there with her too, which was a great help. I know she loves you. Both of my, yeah, but especially Mel, because she had that experience. And so, anyways, check out the website. Check out the other links that we'll add to the comments after we're done. Now, one last thing here. We played a song. That I played a little clip of a song as we came in, because I was like, hey, what's the song that you want to listen to a little bit at the beginning? Tell us about what that song is. And you said, like, this is just really helping me understand relationships. So I thought I'd close by letting you, and we'll play that song a little bit more as we exit. But tell us more about what that song says and what it means to you.
well, I've decided that Joni Mitchell's song "Both Sides Now" is like my favorite song, and I I think that because if you listen to the lyrics of the song, it says, "I look at life from both sides now, from win or lose, and then somehow life solutions I recall. I really don't know life at all."
Mm.
Things like that, and I think one of the things I've recognized is, actually, I feel like studying sexuality has made me a better Christian,
Mhm.
or a nicer, kinder person. And I feel like I like that song because I feel like now I used to live on the side of like, oh, you did a bad thing, or that wasn't good what you did. And that means that you're not okay. Right. And now I'm on this side of like, oh, you were trying to get your needs met.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I see that we are just trying to figure out how to feel okay with ourselves. Oh, I recognize that you're hurting from this experience. And so there's just so much more depth and layers to all of us and to all of our situations. And that song, I think, makes me think about that. And that I hope that as I go through life, I can be that person who sits with people to say, how can I support you? And how can we be in this together? So that's what I think sexuality and sex education is like.
Well, I love it. And thank you so much for joining me tonight on Humpday Afterglow. And listen, I know I came up with a weird.
At first, I was just like, I don't know what this is. What
is this
like,
about? Yeah, I know.
What is it about? Yes.
I've discovered, speaking of, understanding more about ourselves, I have a part of me that really loves just to go like move into like awkward spaces and make things awkward intentionally at times, just because it's like, oh, and then you get people's like real reactions, and it kind of throws them off because we're all used to like living a very formulaic life. And so I have my inner joker that likes to just kind of jump in and be like, I'm just going to create some chaos or some different like, what is this? Humpday Nooner or Afterglow? It was originally Humpday Nooner. I mean, talk about loaded. Now I moved it to Humpday Afterglow because we changed the time. But anyways, thank you, Kara, so much. And hey, if you've enjoyed this, you've been watching it, just drop comments. If you're interested, you found this interesting, you want to be notified when I go live at other times or drop other videos, please make sure you do all that normal stuff that we do these days as far as liking or subscribing and turning on notifications for this or Instagram. Next week, it's Halloween. We have a Thursday one. It's actually on Halloween. So it's a special one. Be on the lookout for more information. It's going to be later at night because I'm going to be trick-or-treating. Amanda and I are going to be trick-or-treating with the girls. So be on the lookout on Instagram for some fun things in store for that. But until then, listen, have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much, Kara, for joining us. And I'm just gonna put on that music again, and we will.
I've looked at clouds from both sides now, gone up and down, and still somehow it's cloud illusions. I recall, I really